Crypt of the Necrodancer was released in 2015 to critical acclaim, becoming an extremely popular indie title. It certainly caught Nintendo's attention too, as they recently announced a surprise sequel called Cadence of Hyrule, which features an official Zelda twist to the creative gameplay of the original. By taking a deeper look at the first game, we can start to see why it warrants such a high-profile sequel. Crypt of the Necrodancer is such a unique and challenging experience, but what about it makes the gameplay loop so compelling? Exploring the depths of its design may help players better understand what some of the differences are between a game that is fundamentally frustrating and one where players can maintain a sense of optimism. My name is Resonance22, and in today's retrospective, I'll be giving my thoughts on the game, its design, and why it's important. Crypt of the Necrodancer is a roguelike rhythm game developed and published by the independent game studio Brace Yourself Games. That's a pretty curious mix of genres, to say the least. However, the two mesh together quite smoothly. In Crypt of the Necrodancer, players take control of a single character and must navigate through winding, procedurally generated dungeons in order to reach the next floor. The path to the exit staircase is dotted with hazards, enemies, loot, and is guarded by a mini-boss. This is where the rhythm portion of the game comes in. The player can only act in accordance with the beat of the music. Only one action can be performed per beat, and there's a nifty meter for that at the bottom. Thankfully, the game is just lenient enough with the timing that it feels very natural, and still allows players to adjust themselves after a mistake. This is especially important because some of the later beats are pretty tricky. For example, this one, which is one of my favorites. The soundtrack itself was written by Danny Baranowski, and it's seriously amazing. Every floor of each dungeon has a different song, a new beat to learn, and new types of enemies. The various foes are also synced to the beat as well, which creates quite a dynamic and unique flow for the gameplay. I think a game like this would normally fall into the, oh god, roguelikes are already so hard, and so are rhythm games. I'm probably gonna get destroyed. That's exactly correct. However, the developers took many precautions to keep things from becoming overwhelming, and those are the points I want to examine today. I'm not good at either genre, and yet I really enjoy being terrible at Crypt of the Necrodancer. The controls and combat for Crypt of the Necrodancer are thankfully quite simple, and that is necessary because the game requires players to focus on the complex map layout and multiple enemy behaviors. The real obstacle here is not executing insane combos, but rather it's all about careful decision making. Now, what makes Crypt of the Necrodancer so good? This game is excellent across the board, but if I had to pick a few qualities that make it stand out from the crowd, it would likely be the unique way that it handles progression. Crypt of the Necrodancer is not a long game from a content standpoint, and yet, unless you're a natural at this type of game, you likely won't finish it very quickly. This is because there are so many intricate, well-designed mechanics that players have to master. Every now and then, you come across a game that absolutely destroys you during the first level, and yet you keep coming back again and again, just to push a little further. The gameplay loop here is incredibly rewarding. But how does it accomplish this? First of all, the controls are about as simple as they get. You can use the arrow keys or D-pad to move on a grid. Players can get the advantage over their foes because each enemy follows a set learnable pattern of movement. Both players and enemies must move and attack to the beat, and every enemy has a weakness. In a sense, combat in Crypt of the Necrodancer is sort of turn-based. Imagine every beat as a simultaneous turn where every player and every enemy is either moving or attacking. This of course means that slower songs give players a little bit more time to react to the situation, and faster songs require quicker thinking. Enemy patterns are mostly quite straightforward, at least early on. For example, the skeleton can only move every second beat, and will always pursue the player if it's in range. On the beat before it moves, it will briefly raise its arms, signifying that players should move out of the way. If you move into it on the same beat that it moves into you, then you'll take damage. But if you move into it, the beat after the hop, you'll be able to damage it. Likewise, there's a blue slime that only moves up and down every second beat, so attacking it horizontally is always safe, while attacking it vertically requires you to time your approach. Some enemies will move every beat, and in that case you have priority over them when they are vulnerable, as long as you aren't attacking something else or standing still. Once you play for a bit, The combat is surprisingly intuitive. What makes the game more interesting, though, is how it combines so many simple elements at once to create a very complex situation. A room can contain several enemies at one time, which, while easy to navigate on their own, together it creates a very interesting decision tree. Every enemy has their own unique gimmick, and those patterns are always fun to discover. I remember the first time that I faced a Blade Master from Zone 4. Then I noticed that it only moves every other beat, which was reassuring. Naturally, I then caught him on the correct beat and struck him with my dagger. Then he parried my attack and stepped backward. On the following beat, he then lunged at me, which didn't kill me, but certainly piqued my curiosity. I'm just glad that Blade Masters in this game don't go invisible and harass my workers. Only after the lunge, he is vulnerable to strike, so you have to position yourself quite carefully and be fully aware of your surroundings. Those guys are some of the most complicated enemies, so don't worry. Zone 1 and Zone 2 are quite manageable. In addition, there are many hazards and stray walls strewn across the floor, which will make certain movement options for both you and the enemy rather unfavorable. One thing I really like about this game is that enemies can all trip over traps. What makes Crypt of the Necrodancer so great is that every individual element in a situation is incredibly easy to understand. From your movement, to individual enemy behavior, terrain, hazards, your weapons, armor, abilities, and more. Everything is quite simple in an isolated scenario, and the feedback is always immediate. This prevents players from ever feeling too frustrated with the game, because when you make a mistake, it's usually obvious when you went wrong. Walking into an enemy and taking damage is, by design, an experience that is quite loud and is also entirely avoidable. It's always possible to navigate through a room without ever taking damage, but since nobody's perfect, realistically you're going to take quite a lot of damage, and the game allows that. There are stronger weapons, armor, abilities, accessories, and healing items hidden throughout the level. It's just the immediate feedback and transparent systems makes the player consciously avoid repeating the same mistakes. Players are constantly learning in Crypt of the Necrodancer, and there's a meaningful sense of progression. Finally, once you've learned the dance of each zone, you'll reach your first boss. The bosses are each a combination of very clever puns and equally intuitive gameplay. Deep Blues is a haunted chessboard, where every piece behaves exactly as you'd expect. Coral Riff is a possessed jazz band octopus. I can't make this stuff up, it's so good. Every attack here is telegraphed, so you have a moment to hit him before he strikes back. The real threat of Coral Riff, besides human error, which for me is often fatal, is his extremely catchy theme music. One more cool mechanic is that players can dig through certain walls. You still have to dig to the beat, and a couple enemies can dig as well. The idea is that you can always take the main path into a room, or maybe you want to dig around instead to find either some rare treasure, or build a better path that gives you some kind of positional advantage. There's a significant risk versus reward aspect here though, because sometimes you might dig into a variety of trapped rooms if you're too greedy with your spelunking. Also, if you take too long and the song ends, then you'll be dropped into the next floor, trapped inside an arena filled with enemies and mini-bosses. This is beatable, but of course not the type of risk you'll generally want to take when your health is precious. Spending too long digging, you may miss other points of interest in the level as well, like the shopkeeper, chests, NPCs, and statues that will grant you great power for a steep price. Sometimes that price is all of your health, so make sure that you read the fine print. Another quality aspect of Crypt of the Necrodancer is how it avoids becoming repetitive. Like I mentioned earlier, you're likely going to have to repeat levels several times, and maybe for hours. And so the game employs two systems to address this. Well, it actually employs more than two systems, but for simplicity, let's talk about these two. First off, every stage is procedurally generated, and so you're never facing the exact same situation from an earlier run. From the sheer variety in enemies, traps, infinite terrain layouts, randomized mini-bosses, and even that you face different bosses at the end of each stage. However, it rarely feels unfair, because every new situation is a combination of familiar pieces that you've hopefully learned from. In addition, Crypt of the Necrodancer constantly throws unique sets of equipment at you as well, so even if a problem would feel similar, you always have a different set of tools to deal with it. These two systems reward player knowledge. Since the equipment and enemies have diverse interactions, it rarely feels repetitive. For example, if you have a whip that allows you to attack enemies at a wide angle, then you'll be able to approach those pesky dragons diagonally, where you otherwise might have to do a delicate dance with them in melee range. The immediate feedback for mistakes also encourages players to both experiment with different weapons, and also to behave more cautiously. There are so many moving parts in Crypt of the Necrodancer, and the way that they interact makes for a consistently memorable experience. Transparency in systems is everything. The true complexity comes from the random combinations of simple mechanics, all thrown at you in a limited time frame. Navigating every room is a hectic puzzle that tests your problem-solving abilities. However, at the end of the day, Crypt of the Necrodancer is a brutal game. Failure will be constant, and players can only learn so fast. Having players progress through knowledge alone would make the game fairly inaccessible and probably not as fun. On the flip side, if a game holds your hand, then it's less likely to feel as satisfying to finally get through it. While it is certainly possible to beat Crypt of the Necrodancer on your first run with no deaths, that's quite unlikely, and the game is designed around that. This is similar to Breath of the Wild, where technically you could go straight to Ganon, but the game allows you to progress until you're sufficiently decked out to have a better chance. And so Crypt of the Necrodancer introduces another persistent mechanic called diamonds. In a roguelike, they're usually defined by having the player lose everything that they collected and then starting over. But depending on the game, some can benefit from a bit of persistent progression beyond just player mastery. Crypt of the Necrodancer allows you to take a few things back with you on a failed run, one being diamonds, and the other being rescuable NPCs. The diamonds are a rare currency that you can collect in each dungeon, and they appear in greater quantities on harder floors. You can take these back to the hub world and spend them on a wide variety of upgrades. NPCs sell you better equipment and spells that will now appear in chests back in the dungeons. There are also a few permanent upgrades to your health, gold income, and quantity of chests. These are understandably limited, but players will keep coming back because you feel like you're getting both better at the game, and improved loot ever so slightly increases your chances even further. There's an extremely satisfying gameplay loop to getting closer and closer to success, and then inevitably achieving it. It's so satisfying because the hub world keeps players constantly optimistic, but success can only be achieved through mastery, something that you accomplished yourself. The diamonds are also quite well designed because they're not just for upgrades. You can also spend diamonds to unlock repeatable practice sessions against zone-specific enemies, mini-bosses, and even the actual bosses themselves. Progression in Crypt of the Necrodancer is so great because it's always a result of players becoming more proficient at the game. I also recently made a retrospective on Cave Story, easily one of my favorite indie games of all time, and one that is equally renowned for its level design. Both games get a perfect score from me, and offer insight into how designers can forge a rewarding learning curve. Necrodancer, though, being a roguelike, is quite punishing by design, so expect to be stomped on repeatedly, and in my case, enjoy every second of it. In that sense, it may not be for everyone, but I liked the game far more than I expected once I switched to a more patient playstyle. I also highly recommend practicing in Zone 1 and Zone 2, and rescuing each of the NPCs. The glass key in Zone 2 unlocks the Diamond Dealer, which lets you bring helpful items into the next run. And so, I think it's valuable to examine the well-crafted sense of progression so that we can better understand the differences between games that we find inherently frustrating and ones that can defeat us over and over, and that we still come back to. There's a very necessary sense of fairness that a game has to maintain before it crosses the line from challenging to infuriating. Some games are more transparent about fairness than others, but that's a topic for another video. The idea is that the game must at least feel fair, and it certainly helps if the individual systems are easy to understand. While there are certainly benefits to having a ton of complex interacting systems to explore, such as in a game like Factorio, or basically every Paradox game, there are some games like Crypt of the Necrodancer that are prolific for their simpler mechanics. It's the always evolving combination of these mechanics and the sense of progression through mastery that makes every achievement so much more satisfying. The key idea is that a game can be built upon simplicity and still offer complex problems. These are two different ways to approach design, and one is not fundamentally better. It's all in how you use it. At the end of the day, Crypt of the Necrodancer is not only a masterpiece of game design, but most importantly, it's very fun to play. I mean seriously, it has a chess-themed boss that's a double pun. 10 out of 10. I think that's where I was first sold in it. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Did you enjoy this overview/retrospective? Are there any games that you've played recently that you think do a similarly good job with player progression? I'd also be curious if anyone is interested in more reviews, retrospectives, and game design discussion videos. If you enjoyed watching this video, then feel free to subscribe for more content in a similar style, and I have some other indie recommendations at the end and in the video description below. As always, thank you so much for the support, especially on Patreon, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.
He said he'd found it. Some great treasure.
When I was older, I found the notes you left behind. Directions to a graveyard.